really poor. And they tell stories about how that they had snakes in their buildings, they had an outhouse, and they were in the backwoods of Louisiana. In fact, he married two of his cousins, right? You guys know the story Jerry Lee Lewis did. Well, Jerry Lee Lewis, he was a mess, right? Remember when he married his 13-year-old cousin's daughter, first cousin's daughter, and he went to England, and then when he was over there, they came back and they asked him, they said, "You married your cousin?" He said, "What's the big deal? I've got two more just like it back home." They thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He had married two of his cousins, and he was only 22 by this time. He was on his third wife. So he was a mess. Jerry Lee Lewis was a mess. But one of the things that fascinates me about Jerry Lee Lewis was when he was in Bible college. You may not know this about him. He was in Bible college, and he wanted to be a music minister. And so he was playing the piano, and the story goes, and he was telling the instructor, he said, "Hey, this would be so much better." And he started adding his little flair. You know how Jerry Lee Lewis would. He'd do his little flair. And the music teacher, the Pentecostal music teacher, just looked down at him. He took his hand back and he smacked him right across the face. Jerry Lee Lewis stood up, and that was the last day he was in Bible college. And he made his... I often think about what would have happened if he'd have stayed in the church world and stayed in it. But time goes by, and he fought with, like Elvis did and others, about how he was going to go into the country world or if he was going to go into the gospel world. But Jimmy Swaggart, if you guys don't know the story about Jimmy Swaggart, he had great success in ministry. Now, I'm not a huge fan of his theology. He's awfully bit into theology. But here's the thing that I find fascinating about Jimmy Swaggart. There was a scandal that took place at PTL. Many of you guys may not know about this, but there was a scandal that had to do with IRS money. Long story short, Jimmy Swaggart ends up in jail. In the process, while he's in jail, his wife ends up leaving him. He lost all of his money. Lost every penny he had. He had no money. In fact, everybody had pretty much forsaken him. His own wife had left him, and he was all alone. It was one day that he was in prison, and he said that he was borderline suicidal. He was extremely depressed. While he was in that prison, he said that one day he had the flu really bad on top of all these things, and he was really depressed and really down. And as he was sitting in his cell, he describes it one day. They come to his cell, and they tell him, they say, "Jimmy, you have a visitor." "Oh, yeah." He said, "I have a visitor." They said, "Yes, Billy Graham is here to see you." Jimmy Swaggart said, "Billy Graham's here to see me. Oh, my goodness." Here he is at the darkest moment of his life. So he fixes himself up a little bit. Remember, he's really sick at this time. He has the flu. And he opens the door. He said when the door opened to Billy Graham, that Billy Graham turns around, and he starts walking, and he holds his arms out like this. And he walks over to him and hugs him. And he said the fact that Billy Graham was willing to hug me and to show me compassion when I was at my darkest place, he said it refreshed me. He said it changed my whole trajectory. He said just that moment of being refreshed by a man like Billy Graham, of his character and his caliber. And he said, Billy Graham thinks that much to come and see me. Well, the scriptures tell stories where Christ did that. In this story today, we're going to find the story of where Jesus is amazed by the faith of a man. This is known as the story of the centurion. Luke chapter 7 tells the story. Matthew chapter 8 also tells the story. Look in verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. Now, here's the thing you need to know about Capernaum. Capernaum was Jesus' stomping ground. This is a popular place. This is Galilee. Remember, the thing about Capernaum is a place where Jesus spent most of his time, his Galilean ministry. This is where Jesus did some major miracles. Remember the story where he came and had Matthew, the tax collector, that was collecting taxes, and Jesus called him and said, "Hey, follow me, and I'll make you a disciple of people." That was in Capernaum. That's where Matthew was from. Remember where he was walking along in Mark chapter 1, and he said, "Come and see, and you'll do mighty works." And he told them, "Come and follow, and I'll make you fish for people." That was also in Capernaum. This is Peter's hometown. This is where Peter's mother-in-law lived. This is where Peter lived. This is Jesus' stomping ground. This is where he had raised Jairus' daughter, the nobleman. He had raised his daughter at some time. So you get the setting here. They're in this Jesus' hometown, Capernaum. his stomping grounds, where Peter lived, where Matthew was from, where most of the apostles were from. At that time, in verse 2, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. Now notice that. This was a highly valued slave of a Roman centurion or Roman officer. Now, a centurion means in charge of 100. These were very important people. The thing you need to know about a centurion, and technically it means to lead 100. Sometimes they would be over as many as 500, but they at least had 100 men under their command. Do you know the Bible talks about centurions? Almost over about 6 or 7 are mentioned throughout the Scriptures. In every case when the Bible talks about a centurion, it's in a good light. These men were known as men of good character. Everyone that the Bible tells the story about a centurion, the Bible rewards them and talks good things about them. These were men that were great leaders of great character, most of them. But they came from Rome, so they had some flaws. And so you find the story. Matthew tells us that the slave was a young boy. So get the picture. Here's this man with a lot of character in their hometown. He's over all the Roman soldiers in their hometown. He has a lot of character. He's an important guy. And he has a really important slave boy. He's a slave that works for him. But he's really valued to him. He's important to him. I think it was probably he had affection for him. He's a young kid that he cared a lot for. Somehow, and Luke tells us, and Luke would know because he was a doctor, Luke tells us in verse 2 that he was near death. So this young boy is near death. Get the picture in verse 3. And when the officer heard about Jesus, the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some respected, now watch this, this is neat here. He sent some of the respected Jewish elders from the synagogue to ask Jesus to come and heal his slave. Notice, this was an important man. This man could have easily said, Jesus, I'd like an audience with you. He could have sent some of his Roman soldiers. Remember, he's over at least 100 Roman soldiers. He easily, and he's got this young boy that he cares about. The Bible says he cared greatly for this young boy. And Luke tells us this young boy was about to die. They use the word palsy, which means the young boy was drawn up and he couldn't move. He was laying in a cot, and it broke this centurion's heart, this Gentile, this Roman soldier. He couldn't stand to see this young boy in pain. And so instead of him going straight to this guy or sending his Roman soldiers, you know what he does? He sends the rabbi, the Jewish elders, to go talk to Jesus. That's kind of curious. Now look at what happens next. Verse 4. They earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. In other words, come help this centurion. He's an important guy. Look at what it says next. If anyone deserves your help, this is talking about the centurion, not the slave boy. If anyone deserves your help, he does, they said. Now, why does he deserve your help? In other words, they're saying, look, Jesus, we vouch for this guy. This is a good man. This is a guy of character. This is a guy, if anybody deserves you to heal something for him or someone for him, this guy deserves it. Now, why did they say he deserves it? Let's look at the next verse. Look at what this guy had done. In verse 5, for he loves the Jewish people, and he even built a synagogue for us. Now, that's strange. A Roman soldier that is there to occupy built these Jewish people in Jesus' hometown a synagogue. He built them a church, okay? It would be as if, imagine if for some crazy reason we were occupied by a foreign government, like Russia, let's say, for example. Let's say they conquered our city of Birmingham, and let's say they had a leader in each city, major city, and this guy was the leader of Russia, and he was in our town, and he built us a church, and he had good character. Even though he's our enemy, so it was a strained relationship. He's your enemy, he's your oppressor, but at the same time, this is a good guy, and he's working for his bosses. And at the same time, he built you a church. And this guy is sending the Jewish leaders to come and ask Jesus to heal the young slave boy. Look at what happens next. So Jesus went with them. So he just asked him to heal. Jesus said, sure. So he started following these Jewish leaders. Now, oftentimes the Bible tells us that Jesus went into the synagogue and taught. So these people knew Jesus. Jesus taught in the synagogue oftentimes. He probably taught in this synagogue more than any other synagogue that this man had built. So they were familiar with each other. It says, but Jesus, before they arrived at the house, I love this, but just before they arrived at the house, so get the picture here, the officer sent some friends to say, now watch what he calls Jesus here. What does he call him, people? Lord. See that? That's like us saying master. This Roman officer calls Jesus and sends message, Lord. So get the picture. They send the Jewish leaders, Jesus, will you come heal this slave boy? Will you come? Jesus says, sure. As he's walking, the Bible says they're probably in his front yard. They're rounding the corner. They're about to come to his house. Okay? Now, you know how it is when somebody comes to your house, right? You scramble. You ever looked out and you hear a knock on the door and all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, and you're picking up stuff and everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? You're like, I got to put a shirt on. I got to put something on. I got a robe. I got to do something. Well, I don't think that was the situation. But this guy, Jesus, was coming to his house. Now look at what he says to Jesus. He stops him. He doesn't want Jesus to come to his house. Now that's very interesting when you learn why he didn't want Jesus to come. Now I'll tell you something about this man. He calls him Lord. He says, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home. Look at what he says. For I am not what? Worthy of such an honor. So not only did he know who Jesus was, he knew what Jesus was able to do. Do you see this? He had great faith. He knew that Jesus was Lord. He called him Master. He also knew this. He said, look, I'm unworthy. Because here's something you got to understand. If you were a Jewish rabbi during the time of Jesus and you went into a Gentile's home like this, you were unclean for about a week's time. You were unable to go into the temple. You would have to go through these ceremonies. And so this man knew the ceremonies because he built the synagogue. He knew the rules of the temple. And so this man was saying, look, Jesus, you don't have to come and go through that religious ceremony for me. You don't have to go through all of that. I understand. He had great faith. He said, listen, you don't have to come through. So look what happens next. This is what he says next. He says, I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Wow. Now, this is a guy that got stuff done. He says, Jesus, I'm not even worthy to come out front and meet you. They stop him before he gets in the house. Look at what he says next. He says, just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. What faith? What faith, right? He says, look, you don't even have to come in. He said, just say it from where you are, and he'll be healed. What an incredible faith. That's what impressed Jesus. There's only twice in the entire Scriptures where Jesus said, I marvel. I'm amazed at the faith of this person. Did you know that in both times they were Gentile people? Both times Jesus said that about a Gentile. And you know something? Here's something else that's very interesting. In Matthew 16, verse 15, there was a woman that had a demon-possessed daughter. And the same story just about happened. Jesus sent word and healed this girl before he even came to her. You know what the correlation is? Two things that Jesus, both times when Jesus was amazed by their faith. Number one, they were Gentiles. They were not Jewish people. In other words, he's saying, listen, you're not even God's chosen people. You don't even have the Old Testament, and you have such great faith. Secondly, don't miss this, Jesus did it from a distance. He did it from a distance. And today, many of you feel far from God. You know, we don't have Jesus here walking around today. And when Jesus does miracles in our life, he does it from a distance. So there's a similarity. Now look what happens next here. He says, I'm not worthy to come. He says, look at what he says in verse 8. I love this. He says, I know this because I'm under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. In other words, he's saying, listen, I understand how to delegate. I understand how to send things. He's saying, you don't have to physically be here. I understand that. You can do it from a distance. What an incredible faith. Most of us, if this would have been us at this time, we'd have said, I want Jesus to come. I want him to come. I want him to touch. I want him to do something. He's saying, listen, I understand. You can do it from where you are. He understood who he was and what he could do. Verse 9. When Jesus heard this, look at what it says in verse 9. He was what? Let's all say it loudly. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at this man's faith. He turned. Now watch what he does. The crowd's following him. He stops and he turns to the crowd that was following him and he says, I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel. And when the officer's friend returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. Now, isn't it amazing that this guy encountered Jesus in an incredible way, and he never saw him because of his faith. I want to show you some things about this guy. Number one, he had a great job. He had a great job. This guy was an important guy. He had a great job. Number two, he had a big, great problem. He had a big problem. That was somebody he cared about. He had somebody he cared about. Look at Lamentations chapter 3, verse 21. I love this passage here. Look at what it says here. It says, "Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease." And he says this, "Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him." You understand that Jesus wants to give you a refreshing spirit today. He would like to give you a refreshed mind and a refreshed spirit today. The next thing I want you to see is he had a great heart. He cared about this young boy. He had a great heart for this young boy. And we could all learn from this example, his compassion for this young boy. You know, look at Philemon verses 4 through 7. Philemon verses 4 through 7. This is what he says. He's talking, and he says, "I always thank my God when I pray for you." This is Paul talking, Philemon. "Because I keep hearing about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all of God's people. And I'm praying that you will put into action the generosity that comes from your faith, as you understand and experience all the good things we have in Christ. Your love has given me much joy and comfort, my brother. For your kindness has often refreshed the hearts of God's people." You know, many of us oftentimes need to be refreshed. This guy had an incredible story. There was this guy during the time of Al Capone by the name of Art Folletti. I don't know if you ever heard the story of Art Folletti. Art Folletti was a lawyer, of all things. Not only was he just a lawyer, he was a lawyer for Al Capone. So he was an incredible lawyer. And he had figured out when they would race these dogs at the dog tracks, he figured out this thing where they would have 12 dogs racing. What he would do is he would fatten up the 11 dogs, and one of them he wouldn't fatten up and overfeed, and then they would bet on the 12th dog, and that dog would win because he wasn't overfed. And he was sneaky like that. They called him Art Folletti. And he was a mess. He would always find ways to make money for Al Capone. Time goes by, and Art Folletti has a son that is born. When his son was born, his son began to think that some of the things he was doing was cool. And one time, he reminds me of a story one time about this preacher this guy that had been saved, and he was walking, and he had just given up alcohol, and he decided that he was having a tough night. He decided he was going to go to the bar. And as he was walking to the bar in the snow, he heard something, and he looked back, and his son was stepping and jumping into his footholds and saying, "I'm walking in your steps, Daddy." And the dad it hit him hard, like, "Look, my son's seeing me do this." And it had a great effect on that man. That man talks about it. Well, Art Folletti had that kind of experience. He realized, hey, my son is going to end up in the gangster world if I don't change my life. And he realized this. He said, "Listen, my character's worth more than this. I'm going to ruin my son's life." What Art Folletti did was a strange thing. You didn't do this during Al Capone's time because there was a lot of dirty cops. He went to the police. And even the police told him, they said, "This is not smart, Art Folletti. You know they're going to kill you for coming to us." He said, "That's fine." He said, "Because what matters most is my son, and I want him to know that I have character. And I want my name to be worth something for my son. He said, I don't want my son to get this bad name." So, as time goes by, this boy comes, and just like they predicted, he got shot twice in the face with a shotgun, and it killed Art Folletti. His son goes on and to become a great war hero. As time goes by, he goes and he becomes a great politician in the city of Chicago. In fact, the airport in the city of Chicago is named after Artful Eddie's last name, O'Hara Airport. That was Artful Eddie's last name. His son bought back that name through him. But the guy decided that he was going to live and have a heart for somebody else than himself. And let me tell you, that is how we model the love of Jesus. Today we were talking about this in our First Steps class. You know, Jesus could have taken huge crowds and invested in them, but he didn't do it that way. He invested one-on-one. His 12 apostles. He would invest in his 3 inner circle. Let me tell you something. Did you know that if I, don't miss this, if I disciple 3 people, okay? If I disciple 3 people every 5 years, and those 3 people go out and do the same thing, I will have made 180,000 disciples within 10 years. You see how the model is. Did you know that at the time of Christ, there was only a handful of Christians when Jesus ascended to heaven after his resurrection? Did you know that by 300 AD, there was over 6 million Christians in the world? Within a matter of 250 years, there were 6 million Christians. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. The cross happened. And we can have a great effect. I want you to see a couple of things about this guy. How did he get refreshed? How did this guy get so refreshed? Number one, he understood Jesus' house. Remember what he did? He built a house for these people. He built a synagogue. Number one, he understood Jesus' house. You see that, Wayne? Wayne? See it? There you go. He recognizes Jesus' house. There you go. So, he recognized the house of Jesus. This is God's house. Did you know that? Can I be frank with you this morning? My personality is very caustic sometimes. Confrontation doesn't bother me. And I don't mind, and sometimes I worry that I step on toes and I'm too upfront. But at the risk of that, I'm going to be honest with you. You need to have more loyalty to your church sometimes. You need to have more loyalty to your church sometimes. Did you know that the very name church means a called out assembly? Did you know that according to the scriptures that if you are a member of this church, that God placed you into this church? And unless God tells you that you need to move, you don't need to go anywhere. It is a supernatural thing to be a member of a church. It is God's Spirit working on you. And you need to be loyal to that. You need to respect the house of God. Number two, he respect God's house. He respect Jesus' values. He respect the values of Jesus. He had great love. Like, it reminds me of how that Billy Graham had great love and modeled the love of Jesus for Jimmy Swaggart when he was at his lowest. He modeled the values of Jesus. Number three, he understood Jesus. He recognized Jesus' value. He recognized Jesus' authority. He recognized Jesus' authority. You understand that he recognized who he was? He said, listen, Lord. He called him Lord. He says, Lord, I understand who you are. He recognized that he was the master. Have you done that? You know, that's what faith is recognizing who Jesus is. And the second thing about faith is recognizing what Jesus can do. That's the fourth thing. He recognized the ability of Jesus. He knew what Jesus could do. He says, you don't even have to come here, Jesus. I know you can do it from where you are. One time there was this little town in the Midwest, and they were experiencing a drought. And you can remember, we've had droughts here. Well, this was time before media, and they were having a great drought. So all the preachers in this town decided we were going to have a faith day, is what they called it. And they said, listen, we're all going to get together, and this is our faith day. And they said, we want you to bring one item that reminds you of faith this Sunday afternoon. So they all show up one Sunday afternoon, and you see people holding a Bible, some people holding a picture, some people have a rosary or whatever, a cross, whatever they have. All of a sudden, as the preachers were talking and praying, guess what happened? It began to rain in this drought. In the middle of the rain, this little 9-year-old boy in the middle of the crowd pulls out, you know what? An umbrella. And everyone in the crowd learned something from that 9-year-old boy. Because he modeled what John Wesley said, to expect great things from God. Expect great things from God. Listen, either we have a great God or we don't. Either we do or we don't. Right? Either he is or he ain't. There's some bad English for you. There's some Southern talk. But you know something? We have a great God, and he can refresh your spirit if you allow him to. I was listening to someone recently, and they were talking, and he was 83 years old. And he said that when he was 80 years old, he asked God to make his ministry more productive than the last 80 years of his life. He'd only co-founded the largest Christian university in the United States, Liberty University. But he said he wanted to make the last quarter of his life more productive of his life. Listen, we have a great God, and we need to expect great things from our God. Do you recognize who Jesus was? Do you recognize his house, his values, how he valued people? Do you recognize his authority? Do you recognize his ability? You know what the point Luke was making in this passage? Luke was saying this. Don't miss this. See it there, Wayne, the quote, Luke. Luke was saying this. All types of people are saved, but not all people are saved. That's really the point of Luke. Luke was making this point that, listen, he even talks about Zacchaeus. Nobody else talks about Zacchaeus. He's like, look, even this short guy that nobody liked, even Matthew, and Luke likes to tell a story about all different types of people. He likes to talk about, the different races. And let me tell you something. The point that Luke is making in this gospel is that all types of people get saved, but not all people get saved. You know something that's still true today. Jesus was pointing something out here. Look at Matthew. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 11, look at what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. This is the exact same story, only Matthew tells what Jesus said after he healed the young boy. This is what Jesus said in the book of Matthew. He says, I tell you this, to tell you the truth. He says that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. That's you and me. We're Gentiles. We're going to sit down with Abraham. Look at what he says in verse 12. He says, but many Israelites, those from whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown into outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Verse 13, he goes on, and he tells him, Jesus said to the Roman officer, go back home because you believed it has happened. And the young servant was healed that same hour. You know, the point Jesus was trying to make here is that salvation is for all people, but not all people are going to experience salvation. That's what Jesus was saying. That's why Jesus was so amazed. He's saying, listen, my own people are going to end up in hell. Unfortunately, some of my Jewish people are going to end up in hell. He said, but listen, all types can come to heaven. Any type can come to heaven. All races, all creeds, all people. He said, but not everybody's going to come. Remember what Jesus said. He said, broad is the way that leads to destruction. Narrow is the gate. You know what that means? That means there's a highway to hell, but there's a little tiny dirt road to heaven. And he said, few there be that find it. Let's stand. We're going to sing a verse of invitation. This man was a man that we can learn a lot from. His story is told in 2 of the Gospels. And he modeled what we can learn from this man. He was a great example. He was able to be used greatly by God because he showed great faith. He understood the abilities of Jesus. He understood the power of Jesus. He understood the authority of Jesus. Do you recognize those things this morning? Let's sing. I think about Jimmy Swaggart sitting in that jail cell, sick, at the darkest place of his life, physically sick. His own wife left him. And Billy Graham, by one act of compassion and love and modeling Christ changed his life like that. You know something? You and I have that same power. And I think about this man that amazed our Lord and Savior. That Jesus says, I'm amazed by this guy. This guy gets it. A lot of people want a dog and pony show. They want me to come and lay hands. They want to see things. But listen, and you know something? That same Lord is at work in our hearts too. He can do things for you that you could never imagine. And don't miss this. And when God does it, he always does it in a way that you can never predict. You study the scriptures, and you look at every miracle, and you tell me that you could predict how it was going to end. Think about when Jesus turned the water into wine. He took 6 religious pots that they washed their hands and feet in that were disgusting, and he put wine in them and made wine in them. How could you have ever predicted that? But he did it to show that it was his power doing it. He did it to show that Christ can take an unregenerate heart and a dirty religious thing and make it whole and pure. And he was trying to show you that, listen, you can't work your way to heaven. He was saying, listen, he said, listen, I'm going to take this religious way, this step ladder of how you think you can get to heaven, and show you that it's all through me and by grace and faith. So this morning, I encourage you, hey, have great faith. Have great faith. Do you have faith that would amaze God? Have you ever had faith in God that would have amazed him if he were here? We need to learn something from this guy. This was an impressive guy, and he understood the power of Jesus. He's like, look, you don't even have to come. You can do it from where you are. You know something? Jesus doesn't have to physically be here to change your life either. He doesn't have to be here to do some miracle in your heart. But listen, it requires faith. The Bible says in Hebrews, it is impossible to please God without faith. And Jesus said this, and Paul said this, he said, you began to walk with me by faith. Why do you think that you need to start doing it by works now? He said, in the same way you began this walk with me, continue in the same way. You began your walk by faith, believing who he is and what he can do. Walk in that same faith, the Bible says. You started out by faith. Don't stop now and say, I'm going to go by works. Continue it by faith. So we need to walk by faith. The just shall live by faith, right? Amen. So I encourage you, take this passage, study it. What an incredible passage. I hope you guys have a wonderful day today. We've got our Fall Fest Fellowship coming up soon, okay? So we'll be planning for that. That's an exciting times. And I believe that's all the announcements we've got. We have any dinners coming up that I need to be aware of? Anything scheduled? Okay, a couple of weeks we got it, so we'll be in touch. I hope you guys have a wonderful day today. A lot of you guys, I can tell most of you guys are Alabama fans because you stayed up late watching Alabama, right? And I will never understand how you can watch every play of a 62-3 game, but that's on you, okay? I'm the biggest Auburn fan, 66, excuse me, okay? But let me tell you something. I'm like most of you. Don't you love the boring games? It's so refreshing, finally, as an Auburn fan, to get a boring game. We don't get many of those lately, but it's great to have one, okay? So I'm like, I told Heather last night, I said, this is what it feels like to be an Alabama fan. You can just relax. This is great. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day and enjoy this day and give this day to God. And I appreciate you guys being here. I hope you have a wonderful day. Let's pray. We'll be dismissed. Brother Ryan, would you dismiss us?